When the police arrived, 2 bastards were already dead, and 3 were lying on the ground, moaning and bleeding. My cheating wife was trembling with fear and couldn't utter a word. I said, "Did you really think that I, a battle-hardened Marine, would be scared of these bastards? You were mistaken. But you will still have to answer for your betrayal. I'm not finished yet." I hadn't planned for my week to end with bodies sprawled across my driveway, a trembling wife, and the flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement reflecting off my front porch. Yet, here I was, standing in the chaos I never thought my life would become. Let me start at the beginning, though you might not believe how it all spiraled out of control. It started with something as small as a locked phone. Jessica, my wife of 8 years, had never been one to guard her devices. We'd always shared passwords, unlocked phones in front of each other. It was normal, comfortable. But over the past few weeks, her phone rarely left her hand, and when it wasn't in use, it was face down on the counter. Got something to hide? I joked one evening, grabbing my beer from the fridge. She smiled, too sweet, too rehearsed. "Oh, come on, Brian. Don't be one of those husbands." It was the first red flag, and I ignored it like an idiot. The next red flag came a week later when she started staying late at work. Deadlines, she'd sigh, kissing me on the cheek before rushing out the door, heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a metronome marking the countdown to disaster. But it wasn't just the late nights. She'd grown colder, little things like laughing at my jokes less or dodging my touch. Jessica wasn't just drifting, she was running, and I couldn't figure out why. Then, one night, I found her excuse unraveling. I decided to surprise her with dinner at her office, nothing fancy, just takeout and an attempt to rekindle whatever had started to dim between us. When I arrived, I saw her car in the lot, but the building was dark. Confused, I called her. "I'm still at work," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "It's been such a long day. I'll be home in a few hours." My gut twisted. I looked up at the dark windows. "Oh, okay," I said, playing dumb. "Want me to bring you something to eat?" "No need, babe," she replied. "I'll grab something on my way home." I hung up, the takeout bag crinkling in my hand, and drove away, wondering where she really was, and who she was with. That night, she slipped into bed next to me, her perfume sharper than usual, her body stiff and turned away. By now, I knew something was wrong. I started watching, paying closer attention to the details I'd once taken for granted. Jessica's routines had changed, new lingerie I hadn't seen her wear at home, phone calls she'd take in whispers, and weekends where errands seemed to stretch into hours. It wasn't until I saw the first undeniable piece of evidence that my suspicions were confirmed. A receipt fell out of her purse while she was getting ready for bed. It wasn't for groceries or gas. It was for a luxury hotel downtown, dated from 2 nights prior. I picked it up, heart pounding, and held it up to her. "What's this?" I asked, my voice low and controlled. Jessica froze, her makeup half removed, a cotton pad in one hand. For a split second, panic flashed across her face, but she quickly masked it with a laugh. "Oh, that," she said, brushing her hair back. "It's for work. A client lunch. At the Grand Monarch Hotel?" I pressed, stepping closer. "Funny, I didn't know they served lunch in hotel suites." Her eyes narrowed, and she snatched the receipt from my hand. "Are you spying on me, Brian? For God's sake, you're being paranoid." She walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That was the moment I realized how deeply she underestimated me. I started digging, playing the long game. A Marine doesn't rush into battle unprepared, and this wasn't going to be any different. Over the next few weeks, I pieced it together, texts I retrieved from her old laptop, her strange disappearances, and finally, the name of the man she was sneaking around with, Ryan Gage, some smooth-talking coworker of hers. By the time I was ready to confront her, I'd learned everything. Ryan wasn't the only one. There were others, casual flings and flirty messages that spiraled into full-blown infidelity. Jessica wasn't just cheating, she was living a double life. The confrontation happened 3 nights ago. I'll spare you the shouting match, but let's just say it ended with Jessica storming out and threatening divorce, leaving me in a house filled with echoes of a life I no longer recognized. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be, not when she crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Tonight, she brought Ryan and 4 of his goons to my home, thinking they'd scare me into silence, maybe even force me into signing papers on her terms. She underestimated who I was, who I had been before she decided I was just her husband. When they burst through the door, I was ready. The rest of the night was a blur of fists, fury, and years of training kicking in. By the time the cops arrived, 2 of them were already dead, and 3 were writhing on the ground, bleeding. Jessica, who had watched it all unfold from the corner, trembled in shock. Did you really think that I, a battle-hardened Marine, would be scared of these bastards? I growled, stepping over one of the moaning bodies. You were mistaken. But you will still have to answer for your betrayal, I'm not finished yet. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the street outside my house in hues of red and blue. Officers shouted commands, guns drawn, as they approached. I raised my hands slowly, my breathing heavy but steady, and nodded toward the bodies on the ground. 2 were as still as stone, and the others writhed, clutching their wounds, groaning in agony. Jessica hadn't moved from the corner of the room. She was pale as a ghost, her hands gripping her phone, but she hadn't dialed a single number. Her trembling gaze locked on me, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if she regretted anything at all, or if the fear on her face was just for herself. Drop the weapon, one of the officers barked. I glanced down at the bloodied steel baton in my hand. It wasn't the most elegant weapon, but it had gotten the job done. I let it clatter to the floor and raised my hands higher, stepping back from the carnage. It's over, I said, my voice calm despite the chaos. I'm unarmed. The officers moved in, cuffing me without hesitation. One of them muttered something about how I looked too calm for someone standing in a room with 5 injured men and 2 dead. They didn't know the half of it. As they led me outside, Jessica followed, staying a few feet behind as if she were afraid to be near me but too curious to stay away. I turned my head to look at her, a faint smirk pulling at my lips. You brought this on yourself, Jess, I said quietly. Her lips quivered, but she didn't respond. Not yet. The ride to the station was quiet, except for the officer in the passenger seat who occasionally glanced back at me through the grate. He couldn't hide the curiosity in his eyes. You gonna explain what happened back there? He finally asked. Not much to explain, I replied evenly. 5 guys thought they could intimidate me in my own home. 2 of them made a bad choice, and the other 3 are regretting theirs right about now. And the woman? Your wife? I clenched my jaw at the word. Wife. It felt hollow now, like a title she no longer deserved. She set this up, I said after a pause. But I'm guessing she's playing the victim by now. That's what she does. The officer gave a low whistle but didn't press further. He didn't need to. The truth was a storm brewing, and everyone was about to feel its impact. At the station, I gave my statement without hesitation. I told them about the break-in, the threats, and how it all escalated. I didn't sugarcoat my actions, I didn't need to. I was protecting my home, and I wasn't about to apologize for it. Jessica was brought in separately. Through the glass partition of the holding area, I could see her talking to an officer. She looked shaken, her hair disheveled, her voice rising and falling as she spun her version of events. I couldn't hear her, but I knew how she worked. Tears, half-truths, and a performance worthy of an Oscar. I leaned back against the cold bench, closing my eyes as memories of the past few weeks came flooding back. Jessica wasn't always like this. When we first met, she was magnetic, her laughter infectious, her confidence intoxicating. She could light up a room without trying, and for years, I believed that light was for me. But somewhere along the way, she started shining for someone else. When I caught her in the first lie, it had hurt, but I wanted to believe it was a one-time thing. A bad decision. A mistake. I didn't realize then that it wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. She had built an empire of deceit, and I had been living in it, blissfully unaware. But tonight wasn't just about her lies. It was about her arrogance, bringing those men into our home, thinking they could scare me into submission. She thought she'd beaten me, that she could break me. She thought wrong. Hours later, after I had been processed and released on my own recognizance, I stepped out into the cold night air. Jessica was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her car with her arms crossed. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a mess, but her expression was defiant. "You've really lost it this time, Brian," she snapped as I approached. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You brought thugs to my house, Jessica. What did you think would happen?" "They were just supposed to scare you," she shot back, her voice rising. "I didn't think you'd." "Didn't think I'd what?" "Fight back? Defend myself? I'm not some pushover you can manipulate, Jess. Not anymore." She stepped closer, jabbing a finger at my chest. "You're out of control. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? You killed people, Brian." "They made their choice," I said coldly. "Just like you made yours." Her face twisted with anger, but there was something else there too, fear. She had pushed me too far, and now she was realizing there was no going back. "I'll make sure you pay for this," she hissed. I shook my head, a humorless smile tugging at my lips. "No, Jessica. You're the one who's going to pay. For every lie, for every betrayal, for every time you made me feel like I wasn't enough." She faltered, her confidence cracking for the first time. "I loved you," I said quietly, the weight of those words heavier than anything I'd said tonight. "But that love is gone now. All that's left is the truth, and you're going to face it." As I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot, I felt a strange sense of peace. The war wasn't over, but the first battle was won. She had underestimated me, and now she would learn what it meant to face the consequences of her actions. Jessica's car lights flickered on behind me as I walked down the dimly lit parking lot, but I didn't look back. I knew her too well. She wouldn't drive away just yet. She was still trying to figure out how to salvage control, to bend this disaster to her advantage. But she was out of moves. I climbed into my truck and sat for a moment, gripping the wheel tightly. The events of the night replayed in my head like a broken record, the crash of the front door, the adrenaline pounding in my ears, the sound of fists hitting flesh. The bodies sprawled on the floor, their groans mixing with Jessica's shallow, terrified breathing. She'd crossed the line, and now she was standing on the wrong side of the wreckage. The drive home was eerily quiet. My hands ached from the fight, knuckles raw and swollen. My thoughts churned, but they all led to one conclusion: I was done playing her games. I had given her too many chances, made too many excuses, and let too many lies go unchallenged. That ended tonight. When I pulled into the driveway, the bloodstains were still visible on the pavement. Yellow police tape fluttered in the cold breeze, cordoning off the front of the house. The neighbors were out, peeking through their curtains like vultures circling a fresh kill. I ignored them, stepping over the tape and heading inside. The house was a mess. Furniture overturned, broken glass glinting under the dim hallway light. This wasn't just a home anymore, it was a battleground, and the scars would remain long after the dust settled. I headed straight to the kitchen, pouring myself a stiff drink. The burn of the whiskey steadied my nerves, but it did little to dull the sting of betrayal that still clawed at my chest. A knock at the door startled me. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but then I saw Jessica's silhouette through the frosted glass. I sighed and set the glass down, bracing myself as I opened the door. She stood there, arms crossed, her face a mixture of anger and desperation. She looked smaller now, stripped of the confidence she'd always carried so effortlessly. "You're really not going to let me in?" she said, her voice sharp. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She walked past me, her heels clicking against the hardwood, and stopped in the living room. She stared at the chaos for a moment before turning to face me. "You've made this worse than it had to be," she said, her tone accusatory. I couldn't help but laugh, short, bitter, and filled with disbelief. "Worse than it had to be? You brought a gang of thugs to my house, Jess. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You're acting like I wanted this. You didn't want it? So what was the plan, huh? To scare me into signing whatever divorce papers you had cooked up? To humiliate me one last time before you ran off with one of your boy toys?" Her face flushed, and for the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Instead, she shifted tactics, her voice softening. "I didn't know they'd escalate things," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "Stop lying, Jessica." Her head snapped up, and for a moment, the mask dropped. The facade of innocence cracked, and underneath it was the cold, calculating woman I'd come to know over the past few weeks. "You don't get to play the victim here," I continued, stepping closer. "You cheated. You lied. You turned our marriage into a joke. And when I didn't roll over and let you walk all over me, you tried to intimidate me into submission." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "Save it," I said. "I'm done listening to your excuses." Her eyes narrowed, and the anger returned. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Like you're some kind of hero for beating up a few guys. But guess what, Brian? This marriage was dead long before tonight. You just didn't want to see it." I felt the words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. "It was dead. Because you killed it. Piece by piece, lie by lie. And I let you. I let you because I thought I owed you that. Because I thought love meant forgiveness, even when it hurt." Her expression faltered, just for a second, before she steeled herself again. "You'll never be able to prove what I did," she said, her voice cold. "All you've got is your word, and after tonight, good luck convincing anyone you're not just some violent, unhinged ex-husband." The audacity of her words sent a fresh wave of anger surging through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Don't worry," I said. "The truth has a way of coming out, whether you like it or not. And when it does, you'll finally have to face the consequences of everything you've done." She stood there for a moment, glaring at me, before grabbing her purse and storming toward the door. "You're a fool, Brian," she spat over her shoulder. "No," I said quietly. "I was. But not anymore." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving me alone in the wreckage of our life together. I stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I wasn't sure what came next. The legal battles, the divorce, the fallout from tonight, it was all a storm waiting to break. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face it. The slam of the door echoed through the house like a gunshot. I let out a long breath, staring at the wreckage Jessica had left in her wake. But something felt off. The night had been a whirlwind of chaos and confrontation, but this silence didn't feel like closure. The uneasy feeling gnawed at me as I walked to the kitchen. The whiskey bottle beckoned, but I pushed it aside. I needed clarity, not another fog to drown in. I grabbed my phone instead, scrolling through my messages. Nothing new. No missed calls. Then, a single notification caught my eye, a security alert from the house cameras. Pulling up the footage, I leaned against the counter, my pulse quickening. At first, I thought it was just Jessica's earlier departure, but the timestamp didn't add up. This was from minutes after she'd left. The camera feed showed her car parked at the curb, her shadowy figure pacing near the driveway. She wasn't leaving. She was waiting. My stomach twisted. For what? I fast-forwarded, and then I saw them. A second car pulled up behind hers, headlights off. The doors opened, and two figures emerged, men, large and hulking. They approached Jessica, and she gestured wildly toward the house. My heart raced as I grabbed the nearest object, a knife from the block on the counter, and moved toward the front of the house. The faint sound of footsteps outside confirmed my worst fears. The audacity of her. After everything tonight, she wasn't done. She was doubling down. I flicked the lights off, shrouding the house in darkness, and crouched near the living room window. The shadows of the men grew larger as they approached. One of them muttered something, his voice low and gravelly. "Break in, grab what we need, and get out." She said he'd be drunk and easy to handle. Jessica's betrayal hit me like a sledgehammer all over again, but there was no time to dwell on it. These weren't just hired thugs. They were here for blood. The first man tried the front door. Locked. He nodded to the second, who pulled out a crowbar and started prying at the frame. "Big mistake," I muttered under my breath. As they focused on the door, I slipped out the side, moving silently through the shadows. Years of Marine training kicked in, and the anger that had been simmering all night now had a focus. The second man was the first to realize something was wrong. He turned just as I moved in, the knife glinting in the faint moonlight. His reaction was slow, and my strike was precise, slashing across his arm, sending the crowbar clattering to the ground. He let out a yell, stumbling back. The first man spun around, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What the hell?" he barked, reaching for something in his waistband. I didn't give him a chance. With a swift kick, I knocked him off balance, sending whatever weapon he'd been reaching for skittering across the driveway. The fight was brutal and fast. These weren't amateurs, but they weren't ready for someone like me. My hands moved instinctively, every strike calculated to disable. The first man went down hard, a punch to the throat leaving him gasping for air. The second managed to land a solid hit to my ribs before I caught his wrist and twisted until I heard the snap. "Stay down," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. They didn't need to be told twice. Both men lay on the ground, groaning in pain. Blood pooled under one of them, but I didn't care enough to check how bad it was. I looked up and saw Jessica standing near the street, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. She'd come closer, probably thinking her plan was unfolding perfectly, but now she was frozen in place. When the flashing lights appeared again, this time from another police cruiser, I didn't move. I raised my hands, bloodied and trembling, and waited. The officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. I complied without hesitation, dropping the knife and stepping away from the two men on the ground. When one of the officers cuffed me, I saw him glance at the men groaning in pain and then at Jessica. His eyes narrowed. "She's with them," I said simply. "Check the camera footage if you need proof." Jessica's face twisted, her mouth opening to protest, but no sound came out. She looked at the officers, then at me, and for the first time all night, I saw real fear in her eyes. An hour later, I sat in the back of a cruiser again, but this time, there was no confusion. The officers had reviewed the footage on my phone. They saw Jessica conspiring with the men outside, pointing toward the house, egging them on. She was sitting in another cruiser now, her hands cuffed, her head down. One of the officers leaned against the door, looking at me with something almost like respect. "You've had one hell of a night, sir." That's one way to put it, I replied, exhaustion seeping into my voice. What's next for you? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window, watching as Jessica was led away. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. What was next? Divorce. Therapy. Maybe a long trip to clear my head. But one thing was certain, would never let anyone make me feel this powerless again. As the cruiser pulled away, the weight on my chest began to lift. The war was over. I had won. But the scars would remain, a constant reminder of the woman who tried to destroy me and failed. The cruiser rolled to a stop outside my house as dawn painted the horizon in shades of orange and gold. An officer walked me up to the door, where yellow police tape still fluttered in the early morning breeze. You've got a solid case, he said, handing me back my phone. Jessica's involvement in this, it's undeniable. And those two guys? They're both known offenders. You did us a favor taking them off the streets. I nodded, the words barely registering. My body ached, but the exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was deeper, something clawing at my soul. The officer tipped his hat. Get some rest. And get a lawyer, someone who knows how to navigate these waters. You'll need one. The door clicked shut behind me, and silence swallowed the house. It should have felt like relief, but something lingered. A tension, a nagging sense that this wasn't over. I wandered through the wreckage of my living room. The overturned furniture, the shattered glass, remnants of the chaos Jessica had unleashed. For a moment, I let myself feel it all, the anger, the heartbreak, the hollow ache of betrayal. Then I noticed something out of place. A laptop sat on the coffee table, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't mine. Jessica must have left it in her rush to flee the scene. My gut told me it was important. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The screen lit up, revealing an email inbox. The messages were scattered with subject lines that sent a chill down my spine. Payment received, next steps. Sensitive materials attached. Brian's assets, overview. Clicking through the emails, the pieces began to fall into place. Jessica hadn't just been cheating, she'd been plotting. There were references to offshore accounts, financial advisors, even messages about falsifying documents. One email, dated 2 days ago, was addressed to someone named Martin. I need this done by Friday. Brian can't find out. If we pull this off, he won't have a leg to stand on in court. The pit in my stomach deepened. This wasn't just infidelity, this was premeditated destruction. Jessica wasn't trying to leave quietly, she was trying to ruin me, to strip me of everything I'd worked for. But one detail in the emails stood out. Martin wasn't just her co-conspirator. He was her lover. The anger that surged through me was white-hot, but it was focused now. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice. About ensuring that Jessica and everyone involved paid for what they'd done. I scrolled further, finding an attachment labeled Documents, Priority. When I opened it, my heart sank. It was a blueprint of my company's financials, accounts, investments, every detail laid bare. She'd been siphoning money for months, moving it into shell accounts under her name and Martin's. My hands trembled as I snapped pictures of everything. I barely had time to process it all when my phone buzzed. A message popped up from an unknown number. You've got no idea who you're messing with. Drop it, Brian. Or else. My breath caught. They knew. Whoever Martin was, he wasn't just some sleazy guy Jessica had picked up. He was dangerous, connected, and clearly aware that I'd stumbled onto their plans. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Should I call the police? No, not yet. I needed more. Something they couldn't dismiss, something that would seal Jessica's fate and protect me from whatever Martin was planning. Grabbing my keys, I headed to the garage. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the driveway. My truck started with a growl, and I peeled out onto the road, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had one place in mind, Martin's office. Jessica's emails mentioned his law firm multiple times. If he was smart, he'd already be trying to cover his tracks, but maybe I could find something before he erased it all. The office building was downtown, a sleek, glass-fronted skyscraper that screamed wealth and power. I parked across the street, watching the entrance. It didn't take long to spot him. Martin stepped out of a black SUV, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture exuding arrogance. He didn't look like someone worried about being caught. I followed him at a distance, slipping into the building as he swiped his keycard and entered the elevator. The receptionist glanced at me, but I flashed a confident smile. "Here for a meeting with Mr. Langston," I said, guessing at his last name from one of Jessica's emails. She nodded, distracted, and motioned toward the elevators. When I reached his floor, the tension in my chest was unbearable. The hallways were eerily quiet, and his office door was ajar. I stepped inside, scanning the room. His desk was cluttered with papers, but one item caught my attention, a sleek black laptop, identical to the one Jessica had left behind. Before I could think, I plugged a USB drive into the device, copying as many files as I could. The sound of footsteps behind me froze me in place. "Looking for something?" Martin's voice was cold, sharp, and laced with menace. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "You should have stayed out of this, Brian," he said, stepping closer. "You think you've won? That Jessica's betrayal is the end of the story?" His smirk widened. "It's just the beginning." Before I could respond, the lights in the office flickered, and a loud crash sounded from the hallway. The door slammed shut behind him, and my blood ran cold. The sound of the door slamming reverberated in the room, pulling me back into the present. Martin leaned casually against his desk, his posture exuding control. But his eyes betrayed something more primal, something dangerous. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," he said, his voice low. "Jessica might have been your little problem, but me? I'm your nightmare." I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse hammered in my ears. The USB drive blinked on the desk, still transferring files. I needed more time, but Martin was too sharp to ignore the blinking light for long. "You're stealing files now?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's cute, Brian." "Really? I don't need your files to know what you're doing," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You and Jessica have been siphoning money from my company. Plotting to gut my life. But you've underestimated me." Martin's smirk faltered, just slightly. He stepped forward, his hands resting on the desk as he leaned in. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "This isn't about you. This is about power. About taking what's weak and replacing it with something better. Jessica saw that in you, a man who was too soft, too distracted by his precious morality to see the world for what it is." I stared at him, feeling the weight of his words settle into my chest. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about how low Jessica was willing to sink, how far she'd go to destroy me and justify it to herself. The USB stopped blinking. The transfer was complete. My hand brushed against the edge of the desk, grabbing the drive and slipping it into my pocket as casually as I could. Martin didn't seem to notice, his attention fully on his self-righteous monologue. But just as I moved to step back, the door burst open. Two men stormed into the room, their faces cold and expressionless. They were big, built like tanks, and they weren't here to chat. Martin's smirk returned. "Meet my associates," he said, gesturing to the men. "You didn't think I'd handle this alone, did you? They closed in quickly, one blocking the door while the other advanced toward me. My fists clenched instinctively, the Marine training surging through me. The first guy swung hard, a punch aimed at my ribs. I twisted to the side, grabbing his wrist and driving my knee into his stomach. He staggered back, gasping, but the second guy was already on me, slamming me against the wall. The air rushed out of my lungs, but I didn't hesitate. I brought my elbow down on his forearm, forcing him to release me, and spun to deliver a solid kick to his knee. The room erupted into chaos. Martin barked orders, but the fight had taken on a life of its own. The first man lunged again, his movements slower now, and I used his momentum against him, flipping him over my shoulder and slamming him onto the desk. Papers and electronics crashed to the floor. The second man grabbed a chair, swinging it like a weapon, but I ducked, the chair shattering against the wall behind me. "Enough!" Martin shouted, reaching for a drawer in his desk. The glint of metal caught my eye, a gun. Adrenaline surged, and I reacted without thinking. I grabbed the remains of the broken chair and hurled it at Martin. The makeshift projectile knocked the gun from his hands, sending it skidding across the floor. The distraction gave me the opening I needed. I grabbed the second man, slamming his head into the desk, and he crumpled to the ground. The first man was already unconscious, sprawled across the remains of the chair. Martin backed up, his hands raised. For the first time, his confidence faltered. "You've got no idea what you're doing," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you're winning? This doesn't end here." I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "It ends when I say it ends." The door burst open again, but this time it wasn't more of Martin's goons. It was the police. Their guns were drawn, their voices booming as they shouted commands. I raised my hands slowly, stepping back from Martin. The officers moved quickly, securing the room. One of them grabbed Martin, slamming him against the desk and cuffing him. Another officer turned to me, his expression hard. "Are you Brian Mason?" I nodded, still catching my breath. "We've been tracking this operation for months," he said, gesturing to Martin and the unconscious men. "Looks like you just handed us everything we needed." As they escorted Martin out of the room, he glared at me, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over, Brian. You'll pay for this." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the USB drive in my pocket and the knowledge that I now had the upper hand. Back in the quiet of my truck, I let out a long breath. The weight of the night pressed down on me, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Jessica and Martin had underestimated me. They thought I was weak, that I'd crumble under the weight of their schemes. But they were wrong. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by piece. As the sun climbed higher, I started the engine and drove away, leaving the chaos behind. But in my mind, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. I drove for what felt like hours, the events of the morning replaying in my mind like a broken record. The adrenaline had subsided, leaving behind a dull ache in my muscles and a searing anger in my chest. Every mile away from Martin's office felt like a step closer to clarity, but I knew better than to think this nightmare was over. The USB drive sat in my pocket like a ticking time bomb. It held answers, sure, but it also raised questions, ones I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house loomed ahead like a specter. The damage from the night before was still there, the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, and the echoes of betrayal lingering in every corner. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting another ambush. But the silence was absolute. Dropping the USB drive onto the kitchen counter, I stared at it for a long moment. What if it didn't hold enough evidence? What if Martin had been bluffing, leaving me breadcrumbs that led nowhere? I plugged it into my laptop, my fingers hovering over the trackpad as the files loaded. The folder labeled Priority opened to reveal dozens of documents. Spreadsheets, emails, even scanned contracts. My eyes skimmed over the first few files, my stomach twisting as the extent of their betrayal unfolded. Jessica had been planning this for years. Her name was everywhere, on account transfers, on false invoices, even on documents authorizing illegal withdrawals. But as I dug deeper, something else caught my attention. It wasn't just Jessica and Martin. There was a third name. Ethan Walker. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan was my oldest friend, someone I'd trusted implicitly. We'd grown up together, gone to the same schools, even served in the Marines side by side. He'd been there when I started my company, offering advice and support at every turn. And now his name was on a contract, signed alongside Jessica's, approving the transfer of my assets into offshore accounts. I couldn't believe it. Ethan wasn't just a friend, he was family. He'd been at my wedding, held my firstborn son in his arms. If Jessica's betrayal was a knife in my back, Ethan's was a bullet to the heart. The phone in my pocket buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text message, and the sender was Jessica. "We need to talk. Come to the cabin." Alone. The cabin. Of course. The cabin was a remote property we'd bought years ago, nestled in the woods an hour outside the city. It was meant to be a retreat, a place to escape the pressures of life. Now, it felt like a trap. But I didn't hesitate. If Jessica wanted to talk, I'd be there. Not because I believed she'd tell the truth, but because I needed to end this face-to-face. I grabbed my keys and the USB drive, stuffing it into my pocket as I headed back to the truck. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, the winding roads lined with dense forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. Jessica's car was parked outside, but there was no sign of her. I approached cautiously, every instinct on high alert. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside to find Jessica sitting at the dining table, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "You came." I didn't sit down. "Cut the crap, Jessica. Why am I here?" She sighed, setting the glass down and leaning back in her chair. "I know you've been digging. You've probably got the whole story by now. But there's more to this than you think." I crossed my arms, glaring at her. "You're going to try and justify this? You and Martin stealing from me? Ethan, too? What's the angle, Jessica? Enlighten me." Her face twisted into a bitter smile. "Ethan. Of course, you found out about him. You always were too curious for your own good." I stepped closer, my patience wearing thin. "Start talking." Jessica's tone shifted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ethan came to me first. He said you were hiding money, using the company as a front. I didn't believe him at first, but he showed me documents, proof that you were siphoning funds into your own private accounts." My jaw tightened. "That's a lie, and you know it." "Is it?" she shot back, her eyes narrowing. "How do I know what's real anymore? You've always been so secretive, so controlling. Ethan said you'd never let me leave cleanly, so I decided to take what I deserved." The anger bubbled up, threatening to boil over. "What you deserved? You destroyed our marriage, sold me out, and you're playing the victim?" Jessica didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the table. The silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps outside. I spun toward the window, catching a glimpse of movement in the shadows. My hand instinctively went to my side, wishing I'd brought a weapon. The door burst open, and Ethan stepped inside, his face as cold and calculating as I'd ever seen it. "Brian," he said, his tone calm. "You should have stayed out of this." My heart raced, the betrayal hitting me all over again. "Ethan. You're working with her?" He shrugged. Working with her? No, Brian. I'm running the show. Jessica stood up, her posture tense. Ethan, this wasn't the plan. Plans change, he snapped, cutting her off. Brian knows too much now. We can't let him walk out of here. My fists clenched, my body tense and ready. You think you're going to stop me? Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. Jessica gasped, stepping back. Ethan, what are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago, he said, leveling the weapon at me. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Ethan's eyes widened in shock as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the cabin. The cavalry had arrived. The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights bathing the cabin in their unforgiving glow. Ethan froze, his gun still aimed at me, but now his hand was trembling. Jessica backed away, her face pale, her once cocky demeanor shattered. I didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on Ethan, my body coiled like a spring. If he so much as twitched, I was ready. Ethan, I said, my voice low and steady, it's over. Drop the gun. His eyes darted between me, Jessica, and the window where the police were spilling out of their cars, shouting commands. You think they'll save you? He hissed. You think this ends here? You don't understand, Brian. I had to do this. You left me no choice. The door slammed open, and the officers flooded the cabin, their weapons drawn. Drop the weapon, one of them barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, time stood still. Ethan's grip tightened on the gun, his jaw clenched in defiance. I could see the calculations running through his mind, the desperation, the fear. But then he made his decision. With a roar of frustration, Ethan hurled the gun to the floor and raised his hands. The police moved in swiftly, forcing him to the ground and cuffing him. Jessica stood frozen, her hands trembling as an officer approached her. Ma'am, you're under arrest. Hands behind your back. What? She shrieked, her voice cracking. I didn't do anything. I didn't. You've done plenty, I said coldly, finally breaking my silence. And now you'll answer for all of it. As the police hauled them both outside, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, and a strange, hollow sense of closure. The lead officer approached me, his expression unreadable. Mr. Mason, we've been monitoring Ethan Walker and Jessica Mason for some time. Your actions today helped us gather the final pieces of evidence we needed. I nodded, still trying to process everything. It wasn't just them, I said, pulling the USB drive from my pocket. Martin Williams was involved, too. You'll find everything you need here. He took the drive, giving me a small nod of appreciation. We'll follow up on this. For now, we recommend you get some rest. You've been through a lot. As they drove away with Ethan and Jessica in the back of separate police cars, I stood alone in the cabin. The silence was deafening. I walked to the shattered window, staring out into the dark woods. This place had once been a sanctuary, a symbol of everything good in my life. Now, it felt like a graveyard for memories. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, statements, and countless questions. The evidence on the USB drive was damning enough to secure charges against Ethan, Jessica, and Martin. Their scheme to siphon my company's assets and frame me for embezzlement unraveled completely. Jessica tried to play the victim in court, claiming she'd been manipulated by Ethan and Martin, but the paper trail said otherwise. Her lies, once so convincing, fell apart under scrutiny. Ethan, for his part, showed no remorse. He admitted to orchestrating the entire plot, justifying it as payback for perceived slights that existed only in his mind. When the verdicts were read, guilty on all counts, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Justice had been served, but it was a bittersweet victory. The house felt emptier than ever. Every room echoed with the ghosts of what once was, and I found myself questioning everything. How had I missed the signs? How had I allowed myself to be surrounded by people who could betray me so completely? But as the days turned into weeks, I began to rebuild. I sold the cabin, unable to bear the memories it held, and focused on repairing my company's reputation. My employees rallied behind me, their loyalty a testament to the years I'd spent building something real, something honest. I also sought solace in therapy, unraveling the knots of anger and grief that Jessica and Ethan had left behind. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. I'd learned something invaluable through all of this: betrayal doesn't define you. It hurts, it cuts deep, but it doesn't have to break you. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth grounding me in the moment. If there was one piece of advice I could offer to anyone facing the kind of darkness I'd endured, it was this: trust yourself. Even when the world falls apart, even when the people you love the most turn their backs on you, you have the strength to stand. You just have to find it. As the stars began to appear, I allowed myself a small smile. Jessica, Ethan, and Martin were gone, their toxicity purged from my life. And while the scars they'd left would never fully fade, they were a reminder of the battles I'd fought, and won. I was still standing. And that, I realized, was enough.